Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrew Sperling. I'm with the National Alliance on Mental Illness. We're going to start in a couple of minutes, but we want to at least acknowledge and thank everyone for being on this webinar today on the new HUD Section 811 Project Rental Assistance demo. We're going to start in just a couple of minutes, but we wanted you to know that we're glad you're here, and we're going to wait for a few more people to get on just a couple of minutes. Bear with us. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the TAC-CCD joint webinar to talk about the new HUD exciting innovative NOFA that came out for the project, or the Section 811 Project Rental Assistance Demonstration Project. Before I get started, I'm going to introduce your speakers for today. My name is Gina Shack. I work for the Technical Assistance Collaborative, and you also have Lisa Sloan from TAC on the phone as well. I have Andrew Sperling from the National Alliance on Mental Illness, who is CCD co-chair, Housing Task Force co-chair. Before we get started, I just wanted to run through the agenda quickly and talk about a couple logistics. So the presentation today will last about 45 minutes or so, and it's really targeted to CCD members and their affiliates across the country. So we've changed the size a little bit. There have been a couple webinars that have already presented on between HUD, TAC did 2 webinars last week, and CMS and new additions to the webinar, a couple webinars last week. So if you were on any of those webinars, they were, there's some changes, or there's some things that are the same, but there's also some nuances to really kind of target to folks out there that are part of CCD. So Andrew's going to begin talking a little bit about the NOFA context. Then we're going to I'll go over the PRA NOFA highlights in the demo, and then we're going to wrap it up with how CCD members and their affiliates can participate and bring these resources to your state. We'll leave some time at the end for questions, at least 30 minutes. If there's more, we'll we'll write them down and post them on TAC's website. If you probably heard this when you called in, but your phones are muted just because of the high number of folks we have calling in. So I'll go over in a minute how we're going to do the question and answer section. And I also wanted to let folks know that the PowerPoints are available on the TAC-811 website. It's 811resourcecenter.tacinc.org. It's also, the address is also on that slide. And we've also posted the other webinars that TAC and CMS have done together. We're going to do questions through the private chat function, which I'll talk about how to do that in a second. But if after the webinar you have questions, you can submit them directly to me at gschak@tacinc.org, and or you can submit them to HUD as well. They set up a website and a page that's dedicated directly solely for the PRA demo NOFA, and that website is, or that email address is prademoapplications@hud.gov. They've also posted, HUD has also posted their questions and answers from the webinar that they did on May 30th. And if you don't have that, the web address is a little long, so it's actually, if you put into a search engine to 811 HUD portal, that web page, that portal will pop up, and on the right-hand side you'll see the questions and answers, the first round that they posted. So for today, if folks want to ask questions, what you need to do is make sure that you're logged into the webinar on your computer, and then on the bottom left-hand side, you'll see under the chat feature, you'll see 2 grayed out boxes. One's public and one's private. You have to click on the private, and then select, double-click on leaders and assistants. After you do that, a chat box will appear, and you can type in your question, press enter, and they'll feed those questions up to us. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Andrew.
So I apologize in advance because we were throwing around some acronyms, and one of the acronyms I want to draw everyone's attention is this organization called CCD, which is which is hosting this webinar. CCD is a coalition of national disability organizations, and if you got notice of this webinar, the chances are that a national organization that your local organization is affiliated with is a member of CCD. So we know that there's a lot of local ARCs that are on the call, a lot of local independent living centers, some affiliates of NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, some provider organizations, public mental health authorities, county agencies that serve people with developmental disabilities, the state DD council. So we really appreciate all of you being involved in this. And CCD is an organization that you're a part of because we are essentially the coalition at the federal level in Washington that speaks for people with disabilities, their family members, their providers, et cetera. And then within the CCD, we have various task forces. I think there are 24 or so task forces. One of them works just on affordable housing for non-elderly people with disabilities, and that's the CCD Housing Task Force that I'm a co-chair of, along with my colleague TJ Sutcliffe, who works for the ARC National Office. So we are essentially become a coalition that advocates to increase access to decent, safe, and affordable housing, particularly for extremely low-income, non-elderly people with disabilities, which we know if you're on the phone, it's of concern to you. So we appreciate your being here. This is an exciting new program. This is while it's not an entirely new program, it reforms an existing program that's been in existence for a long time. And I'm going to set the context on what the 811 program is. But before I do that, I have to talk a little bit about disability policy. And those of you that are a part of the local ARC or local NAMI or local independent living center, this is not news for you, but you know the challenge that are going on in states right now. And you know, hopefully in your state, you may be a state grantee under Money Follows the Person, Medicaid rebalancing, lots of different names this has been known at over the years, but this is essentially a 20-year movement that we're underway with to try and move non-elderly people with disabilities out of institutional settings and into a full, vibrant life in the community. And it should be obvious to everyone on this call, but I'll state it for the record anyway, community integration is not possible without access to decent, safe, and affordable housing for people with disabilities. So this is really, in a sense, not just about housing policies, but about disability policy in the context. And some of you may be familiar with the landmark decision from 1999 called LC versus Olmstead, where the Supreme Court articulated a clear standard that inappropriate institutionalization of people with disabilities is a violation of Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act. It was a big, important decision, and for the last 12 years, states have moved forward, sometimes at a very slow pace, and the most recent couple of years at a more accelerated pace, to try and implement that decision, to put in plans in place to move people out of inappropriate or unnecessary institutionalization and into and to move toward community integration. There's also been concurrent with this a number of states, hundreds of, actually more than 500 jurisdictions all across the country, states and counties, have put in place comprehensive plans to end chronic homelessness. And what we know about chronic homelessness is that people with disabilities who get homeless stay homeless for long periods. And that's why many of us in CCD have been very engaged in ending chronic homelessness. And this policy, this new program, this new revised 811 program is consistent with the goals of those plans at the state and local level to end chronic homelessness. So we have to the 811 program has to meet these challenges of community integration and ending chronic homelessness by providing housing, community-based, affordable rental housing for people with disabilities, doing it in integrated settings, and engaging the community in providing units. So the way we do that is not to have the disability system, if you will, whether it's a public mental health system, a public developmental disability system, or a public disability agency owning and running the housing. It's about finding mainstream resources and mainstream affordable housing resources that are run by your affordable housing system, your housing authorities, and your state housing agencies. And we always make a point of this within CCD of saying, well, why is it we look to the mainstream affordable housing system to do that? Well, the main reason is because, quite frankly, people with disabilities, not elderly people with disabilities, and in particular those living on SSI, are extremely low income. We don't measure poverty in the housing system by your percentage of the federal poverty level. We do it on the basis of area median income. And many of HUD's programs are targeted at people at 50 and 60 and 70% of area median income. But what we want at 811 is a program that's designed to serve people on SSI, and they're at 18% of median income area median income on average. So they're what HUD classifies as extremely low income households. And in order for them to get and keep, more importantly, keep affordable rental housing, they have to have an ongoing rent subsidy because a third of their income is only about $200, and that's not enough to rent a unit. It's not enough to even operate a unit. So we're going to be focusing on the operating subsidy in this new 811 program, which is essentially making rents affordable to people living on SSI. And the other big context here is it's all about, you'll see in this NOFA, when Gina goes into details of the NOFA, this is really all about supporting cross-system collaboration, getting the affordable housing system to work with the state Medicaid agency that's doing Money Follows the Person, to work with the state Medicaid agency that's funding rehabilitation services for people, for non-elderly adults with serious mental illness, getting to work with the state mental health authority, the state developmental disability authority, and the state developmental disability council. That cross-system collaboration is absolutely critical. Okay, so let me talk a minute about the, quote, old Section 811 program. It's been around for a number of years. It's built over 30,000 units since its existence in the early 90s, and it existed before then as what was known as the 202H program. Nonprofit sponsors played a critical role in this. They competed nationally for a capital advance grant and a project-based assistance to support group homes and other congregate living facilities that serve people with disabilities. It's built some good, high-quality housing. Many of these projects are still out there. They're going to continue. Nothing in this new program is going to take those units offline. They're still going to be there. Those 30,000 units will be there and will continue to be there for people with disabilities. The challenge that we faced, quite frankly, over the last 3 or 4 years with the 811 program is that the appropriation from Congress stayed fairly constant. We didn't get much of an increase. In fact, we suffered some fairly, over the years, some cuts to the program. But the challenge is it was only doing one project at a time. And it wasn't linked necessarily to state disability policy, to the policies that the governor and the state was putting in place to further Olmstead or to move forward on Money Follows the Person. So we wanted to align those things and get the state more involved. But I also want to note, because of that flat or even decreased funding for the program at the federal level, we were building less than 600 units of permanent supportive housing through the 811 program a year. Now, some of you might be from a large metropolitan area or a large state. You know that you could do 600 units for people with just developmental disabilities and not put a dent and really make a substantial difference in addressing the crisis in terms of access to affordable housing for these individuals. Some of you are in states where your Olmstead plan or a consent decree that's been put in place to move people out of nursing homes or out of adult care homes is involving 3,000 and 4,000 people. We have to go to scale with this somewhat, and doing 600 units a year nationally is not going to get the job done. So we had to figure out a way to modernize the program and allow us to use these limited 811 dollars to leverage more affordable housing, more affordable rental housing development from the affordable housing system. The program, quite frankly, was limping along and was, quite frankly, and within 4 or 5 years, the cost to renew the existing operating subsidy in the program was going to overwhelm where we weren't building any new units. So we had to figure out a way to modernize the program so we moved toward development of new units. So what we did was we worked with a number of members of Congress, and I'll list them right now because they're the real heroes that got this legislation passed in 2010. In the Senate, it was Senator Robert Menendez of New Jersey and Senator Mike Johans of Nebraska. In the House, it was Congressman Chris Murphy from Connecticut, Congresswoman Judy Biggert from Illinois, and Congressman Barney Frank from Massachusetts. They were the members of Congress that sponsored and pushed this legislation through. We had strong bipartisan support. This is, while you may watch C-SPAN or CNN or Fox News and see all your elected officials fighting with each other like they're children in a sandbox, this is not the case with this bill. It was strong bipartisan cooperation, and it was a number of members of Congress that rolled up their sleeves and worked behind the scenes. It wasn't a big, elegant bill that got a lot of national attention, but it really made a difference in our world. And it's called the Frank Melville Supportive Housing Investment Act. It passed in December of 2010. It was signed in January 2011 by President Obama. It does a number of things. It reformed and revitalized the existing 811 program. We're not going to talk about that today, largely because Congress did not fund any appropriations for the old capital advance program in 2012, and it doesn't look like they're going to fund any new units in 2013. Instead, Congress is appropriating money for this new project-based assistance program that we're going to be talking about today. And so the Melville Act authorized this new program. It's a standalone project-based assistance program, and I'm going to talk about what project-based assistance is in a minute, just for anyone who doesn't understand. But the applicant here, the targeting is to state housing agencies. It does require a formal interagency partnership between the State Housing Finance Agency and it doesn't specify which, state human service agencies. It could be the Medicaid agency. It could be the joint, if in your state mental health and developmental disabilities are a joint single agency, it could be that agency. The statute doesn't specify it. Just there has to be the Affordable Housing Agency working with the Human Service Agency. It is designed to systematically create integrative supportive housing units, and we're going to talk about what that means in a minute. So instead of being a standalone project where all of the people that live in that development or that house are people with disabilities, instead it's going to be a certain percentage, up to 25% of the units in a state housing finance agency affordable housing property. In other words, think of it this way, the state housing agency is already building this housing anyway. It's already going to be built principally through the tax credit program, but maybe through home, and I'll talk about what these programs are in a minute. But essentially what we're doing is taking the units in that larger building and taking a percentage, up to 25%, and dedicating them solely to people with disabilities. And Gina's going to talk a little bit about how that's going to work and how a state has to assure how that's going to work in an effective way, which is critical to this NOFA. We'll get to that in a minute. But the point here is it's highly cost effective because all we're doing is essentially taking the rents in those properties, which are affordable to people in the tax credit program, which means they're affordable to someone at 50 or 60 or 70% of area median income, but they'll never be affordable to someone living on SSI without an operating subsidy. So essentially what the Melville Act does is provide operating subsidies to take the units in these buildings and make them affordable, in these properties, and make them affordable to someone living on SSI, okay? There is no funding for supportive services in this program, and we're going to get to that in a minute about how the funding for supportive services are done, but the statute specifies that these services have to be voluntary, and what we mean by that is if someone isn't accepting treatment, it means they can't be evicted. And so that's something, we always want to work to have services and housing separate, that the services you're getting aren't, contingent on your keeping the housing and complying with the lease. Okay, so let me talk about this chart for a minute. And this requires a little bit of knowledge about what supportive housing is. Or we think of supportive housing as being a stool with three legs. And the three legs are capital, okay, the money to actually build or rehabilitate a property, the actual bricks and mortar, if you will, to actually put the housing in place. The second part is the operating subsidy. I talked about this earlier. In other words, because for someone living on supplemental security income, on SSI, their tenant contribution, usually around about $200 a month, is not enough to operate the unit. And what I mean by operating the unit, I do not mean supportive services. What I mean are the cost of utilities, insurance, taxes, if it's a nonprofit, if it's not a tax-exempt property, a contribution to reserves, the actual cost of operating the housing, okay? That's what the operating subsidy is. And then the third part is, third leg of the stool is supportive services. And I'm going to take a minute and sort of move through this chart and look at what the programs are that pay for these different legs of the stool. On the capital side, the largest program, actually the largest affordable rental housing program, is not operated by HUD. It's operated by the Treasury Department. It's the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. It's a complicated program that the State Housing Finance Agency administers at the state level, and they work with the Treasury Department. They get credits allocated, and they work with syndicators, and they sell the credits on the marketplace, and then take the proceeds and work with for-profit and nonprofit developers to build affordable housing, affordable rental housing. Again, does a good job of serving people that with moderate incomes, but you need an operating subsidy to make it affordable to people on SSI, which is really what this 811 program is about. But there are other sources: bonds, mortgage revenue bonds. Some states have housing trust funds on their own. There's a program called HOME, which unfortunately has had its appropriation cut fairly substantially over the last 2 years. Sometimes foundations can put money in, but this is the money for the capital. On the operating subsidy, what we're going to be talking about here, there are other sources of operating subsidy: project-based Section 8, sponsor-based Section 8. There are programs that operate through the McKinney-Vento program that operate that have operating subsidy. But in the context of this program, that's what the 811 project-based assistance is going to do, is operate the operating subsidy. In the bottom right-hand corner is all the services programs. And notice there are no HUD programs here. These are all human service programs, and most importantly, Medicaid, because Medicaid's the big game in town, and if the Supreme Court allows the Medicaid expansion and the Affordable Care Act to continue forward, Medicaid will be an even bigger program. But we know those of you who work at the state level are familiar with money. If your state is a money follows the person state, you know what that is. It's a Medicaid program with enhanced match, where states are redesigning systems to move dollars out of institutional settings and to provide personal assistance services and other types of services in the community. In the field of MRDD, we know we have home and community-based waiver services that have been around for a number of years and serve and finance lots of community-based services. That includes services in supportive housing, not just transportation and rehabilitation. And then there are state services funds where the state puts its own money into these services. And then the most important in terms of services for people with severe and persistent mental illness is the rehab option under Medicaid, which many states use to fund assertive community treatment and intensive case management. These are the services, these are the sources of funding that will finance the services in this supportive housing, not HUD programs. We want the dollars to go where the expertise is. So let me close by talking about a little bit about federal policy context, because I've talked about it at the state level, but these are similar trends at the federal level. We know that there's a Olmstead. We know that the Department of Justice may be launching an doing an investigation in your state today as we speak. This is the Office of the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights has been very aggressive with a number of states in moving forward with investigations of adult care homes and nursing homes, again, pressing the states to move forward aggressively with plans to implement Olmstead. We know there's a HUD-HHS partnership. Secretary Sebelius and Secretary Donovan have been doing a lot of work in the area of community integration and addressing chronic homelessness. We have the expansion of the Affordable Care Act and a number of provisions in the Affordable Care Act. But what I want to call your attention to, if you're not aware of it, is something called 1915I. It's not a waiver program like waiver services. The state can implement a 1915I provision just by doing a plan amendment, and they can fund specific services to targeted populations. And so that's authorizing the Affordable Care Act in a number of states. Hopefully in the next year or so we'll be moving forward to fund new services, new community-based, flexible, person-centered services under the 1915I option. We also, I mentioned again, the preventing and ending chronic homelessness continues to be something that's pushed aggressively in federal policy. And we have money follows the person, Medicaid waivers, optional services, and I mentioned 1915I. And then we have this new program that aligns with all this. This 811 project-based assistance program is designed to align with all of those trends in disability policy. Because we know that as states move forward with community integration, sometimes the easiest part is aligning and getting a personal assistance services in place or getting an ACT team in place for that individual. But the biggest hurdle, quite frankly, many states have found is getting those individuals access to decent, safe, and affordable housing. And that's what this 811 project-based assistance demonstration is all about. So with that, I'm going to stop and turn it over to my colleague Gina Shack with TAC. And as I introduce TAC, I need to explain just briefly the role it plays with CCD. TAC is a nonprofit consulting firm based in Boston, Massachusetts. We at CCD have been working with TAC for close to 17 years now on furthering access to decent, safe, and affordable housing for people with disabilities. And the work we've done with TAC would not have been possible had it not been for the Melville Charitable Trust. So there's that name again, Melville. Is it the same Melville? Yes, absolutely. Frank Melville, who this legislation was named in honor of, is the founding board chair of the Melville Charitable Trust. And the Melville Charitable Trust, for going on 17, 18 years now, has generously supported TAC and allowed their expertise and technical assistance to work with us to make sure that our advocacy with HUD and with Congress on housing for people with disabilities was effective as possible. So there's an alignment there with the Melville Act and the support that the Melville Charitable Trust provides to TAC to allow them to work with us and to work with all of you. So Gina, let me turn it over to you to go over the details of the notice of funding availability that came out a few weeks ago.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. So Andrew just gave you a broader overview of kind of the policy content on the state and the federal levels. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about what's actually in the NOFA and how the PRA demonstration program is going to work and how states can apply. If you haven't noticed, we're extremely excited about this new opportunity. It's not every day that we get to talk about new resources for states that are really going to further permanent, affordable, supportive housing for people with a linkage to services. In HUD's NOFA, they're quite articulate about how they want the PRA demo to work and their goals of the PRA demo. It's really, so as Andrew said, it's going to act as an operating subsidy or a project-based rental assistance approach, which really it enables people whose income, who are extremely low income, so people who are at zero income or people that are their sole income is Social Security or SSDI, who, depending on your state, are between 15 and 18% of the area median income. It allows them to be able to afford a unit that that is in a larger multifamily building, and the rent of that unit could be up to the fair market rent. So it adds a layer of affordability so that people that are extremely low income can afford the units. It also helps states create high-quality integrated housing within those multifamily units. So it really is, it'll allow people with disabilities to live among other people without disabilities scattered throughout projects and sites around the country. And it really, one of the other things it wants to do and its work to do is that it creates a state-level partnership and a linkage to ensure that permanent supportive housing as well as community-based services and supports are in place for people who wish to participate in those services. A couple logistics around the NOFA timeline. It was released in about a month and a half ago, May 15th. And the applications are due July 31st, so it's about a 75-day turnaround time. HUD is asking the state housing agencies that are the applicants to submit the application through grants.gov. And HUD did a pretty in-depth technical webinar about, or part of their webinar was very technical about how to actually submit an application through grants.gov. The total award is for $85 million. And HUD estimates that's about 2,800 new units. And HUD plans to award make 9 to 16 awards, so that would be between 9 and 16 states. But if there are more than 16 really great applications, I think HUD has the option to go ahead and make more awards. It's important to know that the initial award is for 5 years. So states will be applying for their first 5 years with the awards that they're getting, and then after that, the project rental assistance will renew annually. And a lot of HUD programs work that way. The shelter plus care is one example of it. And the minimum award HUD is asking for is $2 million, and the maximum is $12 million. And we've just done some rough math, and the $12 million is roughly 350 to 500 units, depending on the cost of the area. If folks are interested in reading the NOFA or want more specific information on it, this is the actual website address for the HUD portal for the 811 PRA NOFA. They created a couple pages with information solely dedicated to this NOFA, which is really great too. So HUD is extremely specific in the NOFA as to who can apply for this program. So it's usually the state housing finance agency or the state agency that runs the community development, the home program. And when I say the state housing finance agency, it's usually the agency that runs on the state level the low-income housing tax credit program. TAC's been in touch with a lot of states about this, and we found that the majority of states that will be applying or have been talking about applying for this, it's the Housing Finance Agency or the HFA. So eligible applicants. So as I said, it's going to be the State Housing Finance Agency or the State Housing Community Development Organization or another state agency that's applicable. So it could be a partnership or a co-application, but you want to find out how your state's applying and what housing agency is going to be the lead for this program. HUD is only allowing one application per state. So if HUD receives more than one application per state, so if they receive an application from the State Housing Finance Agency as well as the State Housing Authority or Public Housing Authority, then they won't review any of the applications. They'll throw the applications out. And it really, it shows to HUD that there's a disconnect in the state itself and folks aren't talking. It's important to remind if you're advocating for your state health and human service and Medicaid agency or to them that they should only be included in one application in your state, so not to have them signing off and being parts of several interagency partnership agreements. Okay, so what the PRA funds can be used for, it's very clear, it's very simple. It's rental assistance. So it's that project-based rental assistance to make the unit affordable, and HUD is also allowing you to grantees or folks to use about up to 5% for administration costs. The questions been posed to HUD around whether or not they can use this money for vacancy payments and security deposits. HUD hasn't gone back to us yet, but that's something that we're expecting them to post in their next round or soon. One of their next couple rounds of Q&As. So eligible properties. So this is important to know. The PRA funds could be put in on new or existing multifamily properties. So because it's multifamily, the largest or the smallest property that would be eligible must be at least 5 units of housing. There's a minimum of a 30-year use restriction. So if upon putting PRA funds in a unit, the state and the owner commits to making that unit available for extremely low persons with a disability with the PRA funding for up to 30 years. And when we say integrated housing, so it's not only is it integrated within the country, but it's integrated within the building itself or the project itself. So the units have to be dispersed throughout the building. They can't be on one floor or one section or one wing of the project. They really have to be scattered throughout. And owners can designate certain building types, so they can say X amount of 1 bedrooms or X amount of 2 bedrooms and how many accessible units there'll be. They don't have to in their application designate the exact apartment number, apartment 104, 209. It's more they can designate certain types of units. And the units can be accessible and non-accessible. So since the application doesn't have to talk about what units they're using, but it does have to talk about what the pipeline and how those units that the PRA funds are going to go into, how they are funded and how they're going to come online. So the 25% limitation is really, it's in the NOFA, the NOFA reinforces the statute that no more than 25% of the total amount of units in the project can be set aside for people with disabilities. So and I just want to make sure that's clear that it's not PRA funds 25%, it's actual set-aside units for people with disabilities. So if you had a 100-unit building and you had 5 units that had project-based shelter plus care assistance, and shelter plus care program, to be eligible for that program, you have to be homeless and have a disability. So of the 100 units in that building, 5 units for shelter plus care PBA, then only 20 units could be the project-based rental assistance because that's your 25% units set aside for people with disabilities. And I also want to point out that the 25% is a maximum. States can set lower limits, so they can set 10% of units set aside or 15% of units set aside for people with disabilities. You don't have to go to the 20%, you just can't go past it. Who's eligible for? So people that are going to come into these units who will be eligible for these units are going to be folks that were the state approved through their tenant selection policies in the agreement and in the application, the state has to say who they're going to serve. They have to talk about the target population for these units. And it should, again, align with your state policies and the need in your state. And so it'll be, folks will have to fall under that target population. And of course, the target population can't violate any federal non-discrimination laws, ADD, civil rights. But it's kind of it is outlined. It has to be outlined in the application. So, and we'll talk a little bit about when you get involved, how you can help with that. The other eligibility criteria: the tenant's rent cannot exceed 30% of their adjusted income. So again, if people that are sole income is Social Security or SSDI or zero income, those folks will be able to afford the units, but they can't. Their income can't exceed 30% of their adjusted income at time of program admittance. If they come onto the program, they're living in a PRA unit, and their income goes up, it's okay. They don't get kicked out of the unit. The 30% is just for initial project eligibility. And then the first year of the lease, the owner, the management company, and the tenant, it must be at least 1 year, a one-year lease. So again, this is just these 4 bullets talk about the eligible tenants. Folks have to qualify by being 30% or below of the area medium income. They have to be have a disability as defined in the NOFA, which is quite broad. The program's targeted to folks who are between 18 and under 62 years old at the time of the program of admission. So if someone ages past 62 while they're in the program, they don't get kicked out; they can stay. And the fourth bullet is in the NOFA, and it's pretty clear that it's around services, and it says that a person must be eligible for community-based long-term care services as provided through Medicaid waivers, Medicaid state plan options, state-funded services, and/or appropriate services related to their disabilities. Okay, so I sort of brought this up already, but the interagency partnership agreement is a threshold requirement for the application. It's in the statute as well as the NOFA. So applications have to have this, and there's a 40-page narrative application that your state housing agencies and your state health and human services and Medicaid agencies are writing, and they have to talk about how they're going to implement this interagency partnership agreement. The agreement, if your state, a lot of states are set up differently. If your state Medicaid, the agency that administers your Medicaid, and your agency that is your health and human service agencies, if the Medicaid agency doesn't fall under the umbrella of a larger health and human service agencies, the agreement has to be with both the Medicaid and HHS agency. Okay, so the partnership agreement must, and this is in the statute, must describe the three bullets listed below. So it has to talk about the target population to be served. It has to talk about methods of outreach and referral for the units. That would be, how are they going to find the appropriate people that you targeted? How are they going to make sure the units don't stay vacant? How is the referral process going to work at initial lease up, as well as upon turnover? What are your timelines looking like? How are you going to ensure, and how are you going to sell this project also to developers and property owners that their units aren't going to sit vacant? And then the third thing it must talk about is how the commitment of the Health and Human Services Medicaid Agency is going to make the appropriate services available for folks who will be living in the PRA demo units. Okay, so the next couple of slides I'm going to go over just really talk about what you can do and what you can do in your state and between advocacy as advocates and as service providers, how you can help move this along in your state and really bring these resources to your states. Right now, states are working on two things. They're working on an interagency partnership agreement. So at the table, you have the state housing agency, the HHS and Medicaid agency, and they're also talking about what they're going to apply for, right? So they're talking about how they're going to do those three things in the interagency partnership agreement, but they're also going to talk about what are they going to apply for, where are they going to put the units, what kind of state development, affordable housing development pipeline are they going to put these units in, if there's any geographic limitations in your state, and what stock you have right now for housing for affordable housing for people with disabilities in your community. So that's what you can help. That's what you can help your state with, right? You can initially find out if your state's applying. Who's going to be the applicant? Is it your state housing finance agency? Is it, depending on how your state's set up, it could be 3 different agencies, the Human Services and the Medicaid. So you want to make sure you know who the people at the table are that are talking about this. You also want to make sure that the target population is actually a true target population in your state and in your community. And what you don't want to happen is your state coming up with a target population and then your plan coming out and you as advocates and providers that are working with people say, well, we don't really have a need for that, and or we have more of a need on this side. So you want to be involved and start talking about these talking with these folks in these conversations now. The necessary supports available if the state and HHS agency have a target population, but then the support services and the community-based services aren't there, or they're not robust enough, or they're not working. They need to know this, and you need to advocate for what you think as advocates and providers, what is working in your state. And the last one is, we'd like to think that all consumers moving into 811 units will succeed. And there's times and moments, and as providers and advocates, you've all seen this, that sometimes people have difficulty meeting their lease requirements, and you really want to help develop a system with your state on the state level that they're going to talk about in this application, that what are the supports and what are the services, and how what do you have in place to make sure that they have a successful and retain their tenancy. You do all this work to get folks into the units. It's just you don't want to see them leaving the units, right? Okay, so these are the things you want to think about, the ways you can help, but you want to make sure your staff is aware, and agencies that you work with and partner with, that they know about this program, they're aware of the referrals. The referrals have to be made. You don't want vacant units, and also. I know a lot of folks on this call, providers and advocates. You've been working with developers, and you've been working with management agencies and rental agencies that you know how to sell programs for your clients. So you could really help with the experience that you have with getting developers in these units on board. And the third thing really is, you know where the consumers are. Right, and the state's going to have to talk about where the referral process is going to come from. You know if they're in institutions. You know if they're living with families. You know if they're on the streets. So your input is really valuable, and it's going to make the program, in your state not look good just on paper, but really look good and be able to be implemented. And lastly, of course, you always want to advocate for funding in fiscal year 13. That's always great. This is one of only 2 HUD programs in 2012 that actually received any funding for new units. So the BASH program is the only other one. So we want to keep that going too.
If I could just note on that issue of the funding for the FY13 appropriation, we got some good news last week when a subcommittee in the House reported a bill for the HUD budget for FY 2013, and they actually rejected a proposed $15 million cut to this program that was in the President's budget. So we're making some progress here with Congress on the appropriation in part because this is a cost-effective program. It's only it costs a small fraction of the cost per unit to produce a new unit of supportive housing under this program that it did under the old 811 program or some of the other programs that are out there. And we know with tight budgets at the federal level, if we can show that level of cost effectiveness, we're actually hopefully going to continue to get funding for new units out of this program, and that's the goal.
Okay, so for folks, if you want to ask questions, because your phones are muted, we just have to go through the chat feature on the webinar. So again, it's on the left-hand side. You need to click on the private tab. So you'll see a public and private tab. One of them is grayed out, but you can still click on it. Then double-click on leaders and assistants, and a chat box will open up. Type in your question, and you can press enter, and then they'll feed the questions up to us.
So we're going to wait a few more minutes for questions. And while we're doing that, I'm going to sort of go back to some of just to reinforce a couple of points that Gina made in terms of what you can do as a small local disability organization, whether you're a local independent living center or a local NAMI affiliate or a local ARC. It really does take pressing your state officials on this, because this is a complicated application. It involves multiple state agencies, and as Gina noted, potentially a 40-page narrative that has to be submitted to the Department of Housing and Urban Development. You're now potentially in a busy part of the year, potentially many of your state agencies, if your legislature is still in session or they're coming down to the wire in terms of the budgets at the state level and the legislature. So people are busy, and to get two state agencies to work together to do a complicated application like this is not easy, and we recognize that there's going to be some resistance, because for some states, it's going to, for a state housing finance agency in a large state that's administering, $200 or $300 million in tax credits to just go for the small amount of money and compete for it may not be attractive. But this is incredibly important in terms of disability policy, because we know that as your states move forward on an Olmstead plan, or whether or not they're negotiated a voluntary consent decree with the Justice Department, whatever the case is, having those affordable rental housing, that affordable supportive housing available is absolutely critical to moving forward on this. And at this point, this is the only game in town in terms of new units. States can come forward with existing Section 8 vouchers through turnover, but quite frankly, that's much more difficult to do. This is really the only source of new funding for affordable rental housing for people with disabilities. So it's critical that your state apply, and it's likely going to take some advocacy with them to push them to do this application. I know I've talked to Gina and Ann O'Hara, our colleague at TAC, and they have talked with a number of state housing finance agencies, and I wouldn't say there's widespread resistance, but this is a new program for them, meaning it's not a program like their tax credit where they have something called the QAP, which is the plan they have to submit to the Treasury Department, to the federal government for their tax credit program. That's something they've been doing for years. This is a new program with a new application, with a new system, and it requires them to work with new partners. So it really does, and quite frankly, a constituency they may not have worked with in the past, meaning the disability community. So it's going to take in some states, some concerted, dare I say, aggressive advocacy to get the state in a position where they want to do this application. But it's critically important for us that we get a robust number of state applications, because we have to convince Congress to continue to appropriate money for this program.
Okay, so we have a couple questions. So the first one is, if my state has a mental health agency or a DD agency, that is separate from the state human service agency, how can I get them involved, or can they get involved as well?
The answer is absolutely yes. The statute and the NOFA are not specific that it has to be the Medicaid agency, or it has to be the mental health authority, or it has to be the state rehab agency. Any agency from the human service side can be involved in this. The Medicaid agency is likely going to be the most important involved, because we know that these community-based services are largely going to be funded by Medicaid, whether it's the Medicaid rehab option or whether it's an existing waiver program for people with intellectual disabilities. The Medicaid agency is going to be important to this, because that's the funding for the services, but there's no restriction on which human service agency partners with the state housing finance agency.
Although Andrew, this is Lisa, the Medicaid agency does need to be one of the partners. And I think HUD's going to be posting some Q&A and clarifying some of this because there are definitely states that are confused about this. So it's a good place to keep an eye on the HUD Q&A.
Great. So I think that's it for our questions. Lisa, I don't know do you want to add anything? Or Andrew?
No.
Nope.
Thanks everyone for participating, and we urge you to get engaged with your states to urge them to apply.
Hi, Gina. This is Kia. There are a few other questions that Lisa should have in her queue.
Yep, they just popped up. Can grant money be used for people already receiving support services through an HHS agency? So I think that you mean by that question, if there's a consumer who's already getting support services, doesn't have housing, would they be eligible for this program? And the answer is yes. There's nothing about that situation. The consumer can already be in a waiver program, for example, and still be eligible, depending on how your state defines the program. States have the authority under this to define their target populations. So, for example, if your state targeted people who were at risk of institutionalization or at risk of homelessness, then and that's all they said, then clearly you could be in a waiver program and be at risk of homelessness, for example, and then for eligible. If a state defines its target populations as persons who are MFP eligible, then it would be a little bit different because you might not be in, they're probably taking people off an MFP waiting list. So it depends on exactly how your state's defining it. Okay, another question I'll shoot out to you guys. Will I, as an individual person with a disability, self-supporting, be able to apply for this housing program? Do I have to be on SSI? Gina, you want to take that one? Who's an eligible tenant in for this program?
Right, an eligible tenant is somebody that, the state, through the interagency partnership agreement, has identified the target population. You'd have to fall in line with what the state identified as the target population. And then the three other eligibility criteria would be if somebody is 30% of AMI, so if your sole income is SSI, yes, you'd meet the income eligibility requirement. You must be in the ages between 18 and under 62. You'd also have to have services that are community, long-term community-based services through state waiver, Medicaid waiver, other appropriate services. So if you met all four of those eligibility criteria, then yes.
Thank you, Gina. Another question. How important is detail regarding current housing stock, location, and demographics in the MOU piece of the application? For this application, HUD does not require, the statute actually does not require the applicant, the state housing agency, to identify the specific units that it's requesting the 811 funding for. That can happen after an award is made. However, the housing applicant, the housing finance agency or the state housing agency or the other eligible applicant is going to have to get a handle on the number of units it's requesting. And there are parts of the application where the housing agency has to write about what programs these units are coming from, what their housing pipeline looks like. It doesn't tend to be in the MOU, though. That's mostly in the narrative application. Another question. Let's see. Gina, can you restate or send the link for a copy of the PowerPoint to be forwarded?
Sure. It's on TAC-811 website. It's 811 Resource Center, all one word, .tacinc.org. And it's right on the home page. If you scroll down to the On the left-hand side on the bottom, you'll see all 811, and it's probably the last slate.
Lisa, we've got one up on the screen here where we are, and I'll read this one. If you applied for a $2 million grant, would you be allowed to base the amount of units on your local FMR? So I think the answer there is going to be yes, because always the rents are going to be based on the local FMR. Okay? That's an FMR, for those who know the acronym, it's fair market rent. So there are complicated rules for all of HUD's rent subsidy programs that are based on local FMR, because a rent, for example, in Los Angeles or San Francisco is going to be very, very different than rents in, say, a rural community in Tennessee or Kentucky. So it's all based on that local FMR. And so the number of units you get from, say, a $2 million grant to California, where they're placing people in a large, high-cost rental market like Los Angeles or San Francisco, will be different than the number of units you get, say, in a rural county in Ohio, where rents are substantially lower. This takes into account essentially the difference in housing costs that vary dramatically across housing markets across the country.
Okay, I have a couple others. I don't know if you guys can see them. I'm not in the same place you are. Unlike the NOFA states, quote, unlike some other HUD programs, a person whose sole impairment is a diagnosis of HIV positive or alcoholism or drug addiction is not eligible for occupancy in a PRA demo unit. Does this also exclude those who were originally granted disability with a diagnosis of AIDS? I mean, I don't know what you guys would say, particularly Andrew. I think no. I think someone who has SSI, who doesn't just have a diagnosis of HIV positive but has a diagnosis of AIDS, is going to probably meet those criteria. But remember, there are 4 criteria. There's the income, the age, the meeting the definition of disability, which is a fairly broad definition, but also meeting the need for support services. And I think what my interpretation of what HUD was saying with this in the NOFA is that you need to have not just an impairment, but a significant enough disability that you need supports at least at some points in time to be able to live in the community independently. So I think that's where they're trying to draw the line. Any comments on that, Andrew?
I think that's exactly right. In other words, there's nothing that says that someone who's HIV positive can't have, 2 or 3 other impairments that would qualify for this program.
Another question, is there a universal design element, a universal design requirement? Do units have to be at least visitable? The standard that is in the NOFA requires that the program is interpreted as to be covered by Section 504 and the ADA, which should probably be Titles 2 and Title 3. Eligible multifamily properties must also meet the design and construction requirements of the Fair Housing Act. Depending on what the questioner is asking, in new construction, meeting the Fair Housing Act would make anything on a ground floor and elevator floor essentially universal design, very adaptable. Existing units in rehab would be a little bit different. So I'm not sure that this goes quite as far as the questioner would like. It certainly doesn't require visitability, but it does specifically state that the properties have to meet 504 ADA and Fair Housing Act. One important note is that while many of the folks state might be targeting might be people with physical disabilities who need an accessible or adaptable apartment, other targeted populations may not need those design features, and the application can cover both accessible and non-accessible apartments. It's not required that 100% of the units be accessible here. Do you guys see any other questions up?
I do. Can the grant money be used for people already receiving support services through a HHS agency?
The answer is absolutely yes. In fact, we would anticipate that most already would be. You know, the grant. Remember, the grant money is project-based assistance, and we would anticipate that most states will be targeting people that are already served in their disability system, whether it's in a board and care home or a nursing home or an ICSMR, or maybe experiencing chronic homelessness, and are going to be going through screening criteria and making sure that they're meet all the eligibility criteria that Lisa and Gina have been discussing and are ready to move into this housing. So not only do we expect most people, is that the case, we expect most people will already have been receiving services from their human service agency or from some other type of Medicaid-funded program like the rehab option or a waiver program or money follows the person. We've got another one up on the screen here where we are. How important is detail regarding current housing stock, location, and demographics in the MOU piece of the application? Dina, we don't think this is actually going to be that important. In other words, we expect that because when the state does the application, the MOU, they're not going to be specifying which low-income housing tax credit properties, these rent subsidies, these operating subsidies are going to go into. They don't have to specify up front. In fact, we were worried that if they had to specify up front, it would be a deterrent to states applying. We expect what's going to happen is it's going to operate like states that are already doing a program nearly identical to that, and that's states like Louisiana and North Carolina and Pennsylvania. They're doing it with state funds now. And the way this generally worked, for example, in North Carolina, the state was using state funds to fund these operating subsidies, and they were going to tax credit developers and initially giving them bonus points for their application if they agreed to take a certain percentage of their units and dedicate them to people with disabilities and use these operating subsidies. So we really anticipate that the way this will work is the state won't be specifying which property, which location, which geographic area until after they get the award of these funds, and then they'll go through a process where they'll approach tax credit developers and tell them either we expect you to take 5 or 10 of these units in each of your building, or even potentially a situation where for the following year they would do a set-aside or a bonus or some type of other process to allocate these in rental properties being developed under their tax credit program. Long question, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so we have a couple more. So the first one is, how can people with disabilities know which buildings with, how can people with sorry.
I'll do it. So how can people with disabilities know whether or not a particular property is getting 811 funds? Well, the chances are they won't. If it's under the 30,000 odd units of supportive housing, largely congregate buildings that have been built by 811, they wouldn't necessarily know that, although they might know that a nonprofit owns and operates that housing that might be an agency that serves them. In terms of the new program, they wouldn't necessarily know. They'll, quite frankly, for the person with disability, they'll be contacted by their local human service agency, where it's the local MHMR center or community mental health center or other type of county developmental disability agency that will tell them, we work with, we're an agency partner with this program, and we have this apartment over here that we think you might be eligible to might want to move into, and let's go look at the apartment and see if you're ready to move in. And the operating subsidy will be with that apartment, so the person with disability won't necessarily know whether or not the unit is being funded by this program. It's going to be the local human service agency that's involved in the partnership that the state establishes. So they'll be the local lead agency, and they'll be the ones that will know whether or not this is funded by this program or not. We'll do a couple of more before we sign off here. Gina, you want to pick one out of the pile there? No.
I don't know if we have any new ones.
Oh, there are new ones.
I don't think so.
Okay. All right, so maybe we'll wrap up here. Thank you, everyone, for participating. We urge you to continue to go to the TAC-811 website to get updates on this. And again, the deadline for applications is the end of July, July 31st. So we urge you, if you have an opportunity between now and then, to check in with your state MHMR director or state Medicaid agency to urge them that they get involved in this and work with the State Housing Finance Agency to move forward in doing an application. Thank you very much.